In the financial world, when unexpected document releases create market uncertainty, it signals something deeper than a headline. That's exactly where we are right now with the congressional move toward impeachment following leaked bank records. From an investor's perspective, this is less about partisan politics and more about institutional stability. You see, what we're witnessing now matters to every single American, whether you follow politics closely or not. Structural instability doesn't always start with chaos. Sometimes it begins with quiet patterns we ignore for too long. If you find this analysis valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more insights on how political developments impact our financial future. In my 94 years, I've seen numerous political crises and their effects on market confidence. As someone who has observed how institutional uncertainty ripples through economic systems, I can tell you this: markets react more strongly to unpredictability than to any specific political outcome. Markets teach you that systems need clear rules and consistent application. Now, I'm not here to alarm you about short-term fluctuations. Let me be frank about something. My concern lies with the longer-term implications for governance stability. The congressional announcement regarding impeachment proceedings based on newly leaked bank records represents a significant escalation in our political environment. The House committee has indicated these financial documents reveal previously undisclosed transactions that they deem relevant to their investigation. But unlike previous impeachment efforts, this one comes with specific financial documentation that purportedly shows a pattern of concerning transactions. You see, in governance, as in business, documentation changes the nature of allegations. In corporate terms, this would be equivalent to an audit committee finding unusual financial patterns that trigger broader investigation. This elevates the situation from political rhetoric to evidential inquiry. The stakes extend beyond partisan politics to questions about financial transparency and public service. What happened over the past 72 hours is particularly telling. You see, the conversation in Washington has shifted from generalized accusations to specific financial transactions. New documents reveal a series of international banking transfers that congressional investigators find troubling. From a risk management perspective, the concern lies in the convergence of financial scrutiny with political process. In corporate business terms, it's like when a company faces both SEC investigation and shareholder litigation simultaneously. You see, you don't experience that level of multi-system pressure unless fundamental questions have emerged. The historical precedent here bears examination. Financial disclosures have played central roles in previous political crises, from Watergate's campaign finance issues to more recent controversies. But this situation introduces a new dimension because the banking records reportedly span multiple years and jurisdictions. Looking at the committee's preliminary report, they've identified transaction patterns that they claim establish concerning relationships between various entities. The institutional breakdown indicator here is the unusual speed with which this information moved from disclosure to formal congressional action. When we calculate the systemic risk, we must consider how these revelations might impact governance stability during an already contentious period. Legal experts and financial analysts have flagged several specific incidents that triggered these concerns. The first occurred on the 15th of March 2025, when certain banking records were provided to congressional investigators. Regardless of one's political view, the proper handling of sensitive financial information is well defined. It requires appropriate subpoenas, chain of custody documentation, and privacy protections. None of that appears to have been fully followed in this case. The concern is not just about who was targeted, but about how the information was obtained and handled. Executive privacy breached through questionable procedural means sets a troubling precedent. And in both markets and governance, bad precedent becomes a cost nobody sees until it's too late. But what followed was even more concerning. Reports surfaced that selective portions of these records were leaked to media outlets before formal congressional review was complete. In any system, political or financial, when investigative tools are deployed without following established protocols, we stop measuring leadership and start questioning process integrity. At 10:23 a.m. on the 7th of April 2025, major business leaders began issuing statements expressing concern about financial privacy implications. That's not normal market behavior. That's institutional risk assessment happening in real time. Let me clarify what impeachment really means in this context because it's important. You see, impeachment is a constitutional mechanism that allows Congress to bring charges against federal officials for high crimes and misdemeanors. Think of it as a corporate board's power to investigate executive misconduct, not a conviction itself, but an investigative process with potential consequences. It was created not for political advantage, but for accountability in moments when serious questions arise about official conduct. The impeachment process isn't always about removal. Sometimes it's about establishing a formal record of concern. In corporate business terms, this is equivalent to a board launching a special investigation that may not result in termination but creates documentation of potential issues. The stakes are not just immediate but precedent setting for how financial disclosures impact political processes. When $342 million in transactions were highlighted in these records, that's not just accounting data. In business investment terms, that's a material amount requiring explanation and transparency. The memo from the committee chair stated, and I quote, "These transactions raise significant questions that demand answers. That's not political posturing. That's governance oversight in action." Congressional activity has accelerated dramatically since these records emerged. Cabinet-level officials have been asked to prepare testimony about their knowledge of these transactions. Public interest has intensified as details continue to emerge through various channels. The timeline for formal proceedings is compressing as various committees jockey for jurisdiction, and institutional signals suggest our oversight systems are activating their most serious tools. You see, when Congress moves this quickly from document receipt to formal impeachment consideration, it indicates either extraordinary evidence or extraordinary political calculation, and markets must assess which is more likely. In corporate terms, this situation resembles when a company faces unexpected disclosure of off-balance sheet transactions. What this means for governance is that financial transparency expectations for public officials may be permanently altered. I've seen this pattern before during the savings and loan crisis when financial disclosure requirements were fundamentally rewritten following problematic revelations. I understand why this makes people nervous or concerned. When financial records become central to political processes, it's natural to feel uncertain about both privacy and governance. But let me tell you what I've learned in nearly a century of observing institutions. Systems adjust to incorporate new information. Markets process uncertainty and reach new equilibrium points. The real danger isn't the investigation itself, it's the potential erosion of confidence in financial privacy and governance transparency. And that's something we should address through thoughtful institutional reform rather than reactive politics. The leaked documents reportedly contain evidence of 17 separate international transactions through intermediary entities. This creates significant complexity for investigators and markets alike. You see, international financial flows require careful analysis to determine both legality and propriety. In governance systems, complexity often obscures responsibility until thorough investigation occurs. At exactly 8:45 a.m. yesterday, the House committee released its preliminary findings in a 37-page report. You know what that means? It means our governance structures are actively processing these allegations through established channels. From my experience observing corporate investigations, initial reports often contain both signal and noise. The truth is, proper assessment requires thorough review of complete records, not selective excerpts. As someone who has witnessed numerous financial controversies, I see parallels to how banking oversight evolved after the 2008 crisis. Institutional stress followed by systematic reform. But here's the thing, effective reform requires broad legitimacy across political perspectives. Let me be clear about the current situation. We're witnessing a test of whether our oversight mechanisms can function effectively in a highly polarized environment. And that's when institutional design truly matters. In the hours after the initial document leak, financial markets showed moderate volatility before stabilizing. You see, market participants were processing both the specific allegations and their potential governance implications. When the formal impeachment inquiry was announced, the Dow fluctuated by nearly 2%, a meaningful but measured response indicating real concern without panic. From where I sit, the greatest risk isn't in the specific allegations, but in how they're investigated and addressed. Markets can absorb and price specific revelations, but prolonged uncertainty about process integrity creates more persistent concerns. This developing situation introduces several distinct layers of complexity. First, it involves specific financial transactions requiring technical analysis. Second, it creates questions about proper investigative procedure. Third, it occurs within an already contentious political environment. And fourth, it raises broader questions about financial transparency requirements for public officials. You see, in markets, we call this kind of multidimensional uncertainty a compound risk. When multiple variables interact in ways that amplify potential outcomes in both markets and governance, compound risks require particularly careful management. The immediate path forward involves parallel processes, congressional investigation, media scrutiny, legal analysis, and market assessment. You see, each of these domains processes information differently and on different timelines. In business terms, this resembles when a company faces simultaneous regulatory investigation, media coverage, shareholder questions, and market repricing. What happens next depends on how these separate processes interact and whether they converge toward consistent conclusions. At 3:15 p.m. after the impeachment announcement, financial market volatility increased significantly. That's not normal midday market behavior. That's institutional repricing of political risk. In truth, markets are still determining whether these revelations represent material governance concerns or political theater. You see, markets value certainty above all else. When governance processes become unpredictable, it creates risk premiums across asset classes. The banking records reportedly show a pattern of transactions between several corporate entities and offshore accounts over a 6-year period. These transactions individually appear legitimate, but collectively create patterns that investigators find concerning. You see, in financial analysis, sometimes it's not individual transactions, but their pattern and timing that raises questions. The same principle applies in governance oversight. Context matters as much as content. The $86 million flowing through intermediary entities represent the central financial question in this investigation. In corporate terms, this resembles tracing beneficial ownership through multiple legal structures, a complex but necessary process when questions arise. What this means for markets is a period of heightened attention to governance, transparency, and effectiveness. I've seen similar institutional challenges during the Penn Square Bank failure and subsequent regulatory reforms, difficult processes that ultimately strengthen system integrity. So what we're witnessing is a convergence of financial disclosure and political process that tests our institutional oversight mechanisms. This moment will influence not just immediate political dynamics, but long-term expectations for financial transparency and public service. We're not just observers in this process, we're stakeholders in its outcomes. Whether managing investments, operating businesses, or simply participating in our democracy, we all depend on effective governance oversight. Listen, I've lived through numerous political controversies and market disruptions. I've seen how institutions can both fail and succeed when tested. But this moment feels consequential, not because of partisan implications, but because it tests whether financial oversight tools can function effectively in our current environment. What we're watching is not just a political story. It's a test of whether our oversight institutions can process complex financial information in ways that produce legitimate conclusions. Institutional credibility forms the foundation of stable governance and markets. That's why these processes matter beyond their immediate political implications. Because in any system, when oversight mechanisms lose public confidence, their effectiveness diminishes regardless of formal authority, and consequences of that diminished effectiveness eventually appear in both governance quality and economic performance. The specific banking records reportedly show transactions moving through entities in 3 different countries before reaching their ultimate destinations. This transaction structure creates significant investigative challenges for congressional committees. You see, cross-border financial flows often have legitimate business purposes, but can also obscure ultimate beneficial ownership. In governance oversight, distinguishing between complex but legitimate structures and intentional obscurity requires both technical expertise and investigative persistence. From my perspective, analyzing governance systems over decades, the most significant aspect of this situation isn't the specific allegations, but whether our institutional processes can effectively evaluate them despite political polarization. You see, oversight effectiveness ultimately depends on producing conclusions with broad legitimacy. The fact that these serious allegations will be examined through formal constitutional processes rather than merely trial by media represents an opportunity for institutional functionality despite obvious stresses. That's not partisan optimism. That's recognition of process importance. The business parallel offers perspective. When major corporations face serious allegations, what matters isn't avoiding all controversy and ISF. That's impossible for complex organizations operating in competitive environments. What matters is having robust, credible processes for investigating concerns when they arise. You see, institutional health isn't measured by absence of controversy, but by effectiveness in addressing it. Our constitutional system's capacity to process even highly charged financial allegations through established channels will demonstrate either institutional resilience or dysfunction. So what we're witnessing is a significant test of our governance oversight mechanisms involving complex financial matters. This moment challenges not just specific individuals, but our institutional capacity to handle serious allegations credibly. We're all stakeholders in these outcomes, regardless of political affiliation. Whether concerned with market stability, governance, integrity, or the rule of law, the effectiveness of these processes affects our common future. Listen, I've lived through 94 years of American history. I've observed how institutions can both fail and succeed when tested. But this moment feels particularly consequential, not because the specific allegations are necessarily unprecedented, but because our institutional cohesion faces unusual strain. What we're watching is not just a political controversy, but a test of financial oversight effectiveness within our constitutional system. The principle of accountability, regardless of position, forms the foundation of both market and governance integrity. That's why these processes matter beyond their immediate political implications. Because in any system, whether market or government, effective oversight creates the accountability necessary for sustainable operation. And consequences of oversight failure eventually appear as diminished institutional credibility and function. The pattern unfolding reflects our constitutional system processing serious financial allegations through established channels. This moment will reveal whether those channels can still produce broadly legitimate conclusions despite intense polarization. We're not merely spectators to this process, we're stakeholders in its outcomes. Whether managing investments, operating businesses, or simply participating in our democracy, we all depend on effective, credible oversight. I've lived through numerous political controversies and market disruptions. I've observed how institutions respond when tested. But this moment feels particularly significant, not because of partisan implications, but because it tests whether core oversight functions remain effective under current conditions. The real story isn't about any specific individual or transaction. It's about whether our institutional framework can still process complex financial allegations in ways that produce broadly credible conclusions. That's why civic engagement matters regardless of your political perspective, because in any system, oversight legitimacy requires broad public confidence, and the consequences of eroding that confidence eventually appear in diminished institutional effectiveness and economic opportunity. Thank you for your time and attention to these important governance questions. And remember, in any system, silence is a choice, and sometimes the most expensive choice of all. If you found value in this analysis, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more insights on how political developments impact our financial future.